Believe it or not, the Jets just added a bunch of extra salary cap space this week, but don't get too excited. They're probably not going to sign a big name player with this new cap space. I'll explain it all today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, June 4th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. We could not do the mailbag without you. Let's begin. Our first question. John, I saw that the Jets just added a bunch of extra salary cap space this week because Aaron Rodgers and C.J. Mosley were post-June 1st cuts. Do you think they could use this extra cap space to sign a receiver who's out there and upgrade the position, somebody like Keenan Allen or Amari Cooper? It's a good question, and you are correct. The Jets did add about $13.5 million in cap space this week, and that's because when they cut Aaron Rodgers and C.J. Mosley back in March, they designated both players as a post-June 1st cut. So this gets kind of complex, as do a lot of things with the salary cap. But the best way to think about it is you've probably heard the term dead money before. Dead money is salary cap space that goes to a player who's no longer on your team. And essentially what dead money is it's money that a player has been paid already, but the team has not yet been accounted for on the team salary cap. So you hear a lot about how a contract is structured. A player may make like $10 million in the season. That's the team paying him $10 million in actual money, but only count $2 million against the salary cap. Well, what happens with the other $8 million? Eventually, it has to be charged to the team salary cap. And you can structure a contract a lot of different ways. You can make it like the rest of the $8 million in equal increments over 4 years. But eventually, a team is charged every dollar it pays a player against the salary cap. Even if you're only charged $2 million this year, when you pay the guy $10 million, that $8 million doesn't go away. Typically, when you cut a player, the full bill becomes due immediately. So let's say, again, that you have a guy, you paid him $10 million in cash last year. He was only charged $2 million against the cap, and you cut him. Usually that next year, you're charged the full $8 million. There is a mechanism in the NFL. Each year, teams can designate up to two players as post-June 1st cuts. And what that does, that allows you to spread out the salary cap hits from the dead money over the course of 2 seasons. There is a catch, though. Until June 1st, that player's salary cap number is the same as if the player was still on your team. So you have lots of moving parts. I hope that made it clear. So until June 1st, you don't get the cap relief. It's as though the player's still on your team. So essentially Rodgers and Mosley prior to June 1st counted against the cap what they would have counted if they were on the Jets in 2025. And now that we're past June 1st, their cap number goes down. So combined, the Jets got about $13.5 million in cap space because Rodgers was supposed to count $23.5 million against the cap. His number went down to $14 million. Mosley was supposed to count $12.8 million against the cap if he was here. That number went down to $8.8. So Jets created about $13.5 million in new space. Now, there's a catch to this. Because you're spreading it out over 2 years, now both of these players will have salary cap hits in 2026. And for Rodgers, it's $34 million. It's a very hefty cap hit for Rodgers. For Mosley, in 2026, his cap hit will be $7.7 million. And that's the catch, is that you do the post-June 1st cuts, the dead money hit gets spread out over 2 years. But now, next year in 2026, the Jets are going to have salary cap hits for Aaron Rodgers and C.J. Mosley, two guys who wouldn't have been on the team since 2024. So there are pros and cons. But the long and short of it is the Jets were granted about $13.5 million in cap space this week because we passed June 1st on the calendar. And a lot of this has to do with like the way the league year works, the calendar. You used to have to wait till after June 1st to cut a player to get this benefit, but the league kind of realized at some point that, it wasn't really good for anybody for the team to have to carry these players, because if the Jets had to carry Aaron Rodgers and C.J. Mosley until after June 1st when everybody knew they were being cut, it's not good for the Jets because those are 2 roster spots that are being taken up by players who aren't going to be here. It's not good for Rodgers or Mosley because they wouldn't be free agents yet. They wouldn't be able to speak with other teams. And even though neither player has signed with a new team yet, they've had the opportunity to discuss contracts with new teams, Rodgers in particular with Pittsburgh. It's just not good for anybody. So the league essentially created this mechanism where you can cut a player today. He doesn't count against your roster allocation. The player can now talk with new teams. The player becomes a free agent immediately, and you just have to wait till June 1st to get the benefit. Now, will the Jets use this cap space to make a move? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to see a major move by the Jets. Look, I've been on record that I think the Jets should do something at the wide receiver position. And I think, Amari Cooper, who's still out there at the time we're recording this podcast, would make sense. I don't think he's going to cost a ton of money. And I think for the Jets, you have a first-year head coach, first-year GM. And usually what that means is if they're entering a situation which has been unstable, if they're entering a situation where the salary cap needs to be unclogged, they're not all that worried about the first year. Essentially, that they know the first year is just going to be kind of a reset year anyway. And in the NFL now, you can carry over unused salary cap space to the next season. So I think the way Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci might look at this is, the first year we're not competing for a Super Bowl. Year two is when we're really going to try and hit the ground running. So why don't we just carry that money over? I don't know that I like that viewpoint from the standpoint that Justin Fields is so important, and making sure things work out for Justin Fields is critical for this franchise right now. And I think that a better number 2 receiver would certainly help help Justin Fields succeed. Now, I think this is also a case, we have what I think and what the Jets think. And more often than not, these two things are different. I am not comfortable with the Jets wide receiver room after Garrett Wilson right now. I think Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci like it better than I do. I think that they like Josh Reynolds, who they, of course, signed in free agency, and Arian Smith, who having a big OTA period, apparently. And, even to a lesser extent, you have Alan Lazard, who the team maybe doesn't like that much, but they liked him enough to keep him on a vastly reduced contract. So, I'm not sure the Jets necessarily view the wide receiver position as big of a need as you or I might. And I think that, in your first year, there also can be a tendency to just kind of sit back and let guys compete, let guys, get experience, especially younger guys. Maybe an Arian Smith gets a chance to step into a bigger role. And, even if he's not able to produce a ton right off the bat, the view is that maybe he'll benefit from getting those extra reps. I think Mason Taylor, the tight end they drafted in the second round out of LSU, very similar concept. I've said this, many times on the show over the last couple of weeks, or if you're an everyday or you've heard me mention it, that I think like in an ideal world, Mason Taylor would enter this league as like a second or third tight end, and you put him out on a limited route tree. You get him some easy matchups against, guys who aren't great cover guys. Get him some easy receptions that way, kind of work his way, get his feet wet, so to speak, in the NFL. But instead, I think that Mason Taylor is going to be the number 1 tight end on this team. I think that, early in the season, it might be a bit of a slow start, but I think over the long run, the hope is that Taylor will benefit from all the reps he's getting as the number 1 tight end, because there's nothing that teaches you how to play in the NFL quite like playing in the NFL. So even if he gets off to a slow start, maybe it's the type of thing that can pay dividends in the longer run for the New York Jets. But I think ultimately the reason Rodgers and Mosley were post June 1st cuts, it wasn't because the Jets wanted that cap space to make extra moves in June. I think it was just because like the cap numbers were so huge that like the Jets just decided we can't take both of these hits this year. Because, we'd be talking about Rodgers counting for $49 million against the salary cap instead of 14 this year. And we'd be talking about Mosley counting over $15 million against the cap instead of 7. And then if you add those numbers up, you add all that extra money that if Rodgers and Mosley are counting their full dead money hit this year, it'd be really challenging for the Jets to even field the team that they're fielding this year. So I think it was just more about cap relief in the short run so that they can find, at least field a team that will be semi-competitive. And, next year, like the cap situation is a little bit more flexible. But yeah, I don't think these moves were made though necessarily so that the Jets could make a big move at this point in the calendar. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're not done talking about C.J. Mosley. How much will the Jets miss Mosley's presence? There's the tangibles, where he was a very good run stopper, but also the intangibles he brought to the table, like leadership, being the quarterback of the defense. Is it possible the Jets missed that last year more than we realize? I have some thoughts on that, and I'll tell you what they are as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are down to the finals, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Well, I'm sorry, Knicks fans, there will be no NBA Finals in New York this year. As you know, the Indiana Pacers beat the Knicks in the Eastern Conference Finals. It's Pacers Thunder in the NBA Finals. But if you want to get in on the action, FanDuel's the place to do it. Or if you're just done with basketball, you're tired of hearing about the Pacers. Well, football season's right around the corner, and Jets have an over-under of 5.5 wins at FanDuel right now. If you think that they're going to beat that, again, that's the place to get in on the action. Are you new to FanDuel? Well, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. John, I understand that C.J. Mosley was old and the Jets probably needed to move forward. It's better to have a young guy in Jamie and Sherwood at the linebacker position. Still, I can't help but think about the intangibles Mosley brought to the table in terms of leadership and being the quarterback of the defense. Is it possible the Jets missed him more last year than we realized in these areas? Well, that's a good question. I think back 25 years or so, and if you followed baseball like 25 years or so ago, and there was a bad defensive catcher, his team's fans would all say the same. Every team's fans would say the same thing to defend the guy. They'd say he's great at calling a game. And that meant he's good at, like, the pitchers liked the way he called pitches. Not so much anymore because in baseball, the pitches tend to be called from the bench. We have less and less catchers actually calling the game. But that was always the defense of a bad defensive catcher. The pitchers like throwing to him. He knows which pitches to call. He calls a good game. And this always struck me as very convenient, how every bad defensive catcher just happened to be really good at calling a game. And my guess is that it was a way to defend a bad defensive catcher because you couldn't really prove it one way or another. It was impossible to, it wasn't the type of thing that there were the really statistics that suggested it. So it was like a really easy defense because it was tough to refute. And this is the type of stuff I think about when I hear someone brings up a point like this, like leadership or quarterback of the defense type stuff. I think Mosley brought those things to the table, but I think people act like C.J. Mosley was like the only guy who could do these things. And I also think that, when the Jets gave C.J. Mosley his contract, it was a case of giving a good player just too much money. I mean, they paid C.J. Mosley like he was a franchise defender. What's C.J. Mosley? C.J. Mosley is a guy who's a good linebacker, good at stopping the run. But, in today's NFL, those guys are not that hard to find. Would you want in a linebacker? You want a guy who can cover, and you want a guy who can blitz. And Mosley, in those areas, at best, he was a guy who could be functional playing his own, dropping into his own coverage. He was never a great cover guy, not really that much of a blitzer. So I think that people tried to justify the contract by saying those things. I think that those things do exist. But again, we've seen, you don't need to pay a guy a ton of money for the guy to be a good leader. Leaders come in all shapes and sizes. You can find leaders in your locker room. And the same goes with the quarterback of the defense. I mean, look, the guy who took over for him was voted the MVP by his teammates last year, Jamie and Sherwood. And when I watched the Jets defense last year, I mean, I don't think it was a case where they were, constantly I don't think the issue was that they didn't have the quarterback of the defense on the field. I mean, the one game C.J. Mosley played was from start to finish was the week 1 game in San Francisco when the 49ers ran all over the Jets. I think the Jets' biggest issues last year started with the defensive line being terrible. You had awful defensive tackles outside of Quinton Williams, and your defensive end play wasn't that good outside of Will McDonald. And Will McDonald was really only a guy who was good at half of his job because he struggled against the run. And then you had corners who did not have great seasons. Sauce Gardner had kind of a down year, and Michael Carter II battled injuries. So, I'm sure it existed. I'm sure you could find individual plays during the season where, like, maybe not having Mosley back out there to communicate could have impacted things. But I think this tends to be like the type of thing we overrate. I don't think it was the driving force behind the defense struggling last year. And like, Mosley was like the greatest podcast guest I've ever had. So I like C.J. Mosley, but I don't think that like that was the problem with the defense. I think that it may have been on the list, but it was pretty darn low on the list. Next question, John. All these reports keep coming out about Arian Smith looking great at OTAs. I know you're a skeptic of the impact of OTAs, but at what point do we have to take note of this? That's a good question. And yes, Arian Smith is apparently one of the talks of the OTA period. He's apparently doing very well, the 4th round pick out of Georgia. This is kind of how I like to think about it. First of all, you'd rather hear a guy's doing well than hear a guy's doing poorly. The second is I kind of like to think about this backwards. Let's think about this as a story working backwards. You ever see like that episode of The Office where Michael Scott is in front of all the shareholders of Dunder Mifflin in New York, and they're all angry because Dunder Mifflin's about to go out of business. Then out of nowhere, Michael Scott announces, "Well, we have a 45-day, 45-point plan to get back in business." He just completely made it up. So they go backstage with all the executives, and the executives are like, "What are you doing? Like, we don't have a plan." Michael Scott goes, "Let's figure it out right now. 45 days. Let's work from backward up. Day 45, company saved. Day 44, go." That's kind of like how I like to think about this. So let's think about the end of the season. End of the season, Arian Smith is a success. That's where we start. That's the end story. So let's work our way all the way back. I think that a story where Arian Smith is a success as a rookie begins. We work our way all the way back from day 45 to day 41. Day 1 is probably him succeeding at OTAs. Now, as we know, I mean, every single year, there's some guy that gets hyped up at OTAs, and you hear about this guy's going to be a huge part of the team. I remember in 2019, the amount of times I heard Ty Montgomery is going to be a huge part of the Jets offense. And he ended up not barely playing any sort of role in the Jets offense. It was like the guy got so hyped up. Everybody kept talking about how Ty Montgomery is going to be a huge part of what Adam Gase is going to do. And then Adam Gase never used him. And there are stories like this every year. And it does happen with young players because coaches try and hype up the young guys, and then GMs try and hype up the young guys they just drafted because it makes them look good. We don't know whether Arian Smith's going to fulfill that promise. But it's if my options are Arian Smith looks lost and Arian Smith looks good, I'll choose Arian Smith looks good. There are lots of different ways for this to go. I think, when do we start taking this seriously? Well, I think the answer is you always start taking this seriously when the guy succeeds in regular season games. But that's really the test. Anybody can look good in practice for a couple of times, but it's worth noting. I think it's the type of thing you keep your eye on, because every scenario where Arian Smith succeeds at OTAs does not result in him having success as the regular season begins. But when we look back, if we're thinking Arian Smith, we think about scenarios where Arian Smith has a successful regular season, an awful lot of them begin with OTAs where he starts standing out. People start, he starts turning heads, and people take notice. So that's something worth discussing. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to Sauce Gardner. One of our listeners has found something he thinks is a weakness in Sauce's game, and I both agree and disagree with the take, and I'll explain how that is as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Let's continue now with a question from Charlie, who writes, "Just so you don't think I'm a Sauce hater, I was very high on him in the draft, and I thought he was worthy of going first overall. But early in his career, I've had one concern. Is he so dependent on watching receivers' body language, especially their hands, to time his pass breakups, that they find ways to throw him off? Now, even if I was capable of seeing that type of detail as an out-of-fan Jets fan, I'm lucky if the bar will give me a small TV in the corner these days, so I would not see it. Have you ever seen evidence that receivers are finding ways to deceive him?" So I actually kind of agree and disagree with Charlie on this one. I do think that's a big part of Sauce's game, is that if you watch him in coverage, he kind of reads the receiver's hands, and that's kind of how he times it when he tries to break passes up. And I think, to this point in his career, he's been very successful. I don't think that's a huge problem though, because I think it's very difficult to deceive somebody with your hands trying to catch the football, because you really, as a receiver, you have to concentrate. It's tough to like throw a fake, throw a fake catch before the ball arrives and then reach out and catch the football. I think that's fine technique. My understanding is that that's just the way some guys coach it. I think with Sauce Gardner, there are certain limitations to his game. I think one of his limitations, biggest limitation, is that you're never going to have a great tackler. That's just not Sauce's game. Some great corners are great tacklers. Revis was a great tackler, but not all of them. Some of them just really don't love tackling, and I think that's Sauce Gardner. I think you live with the good and bad of every player. With Sauce Gardner, there's an awful lot of good. One of them is just like he's not a great tackler. The second is he's probably not a guy who's going to be consistent, like who's going to consistently put up big interception stats. And the way he plays might have something to do with that, because I think what Charlie might be getting at is that Sauce doesn't really. It's a lot of instances where Sauce doesn't turn his head, where he's just reading the receiver's hands and trying to break the pass up. So if you're doing that, it's tough to get interceptions. And Aaron Glenn's going to move to more of a man-to-man defense. It's tougher to get interceptions than man-to-man anyway, because you're focused on your guy. You have to follow your guy across the field. So you always have to have your eye on him. Whereas when you're playing zone, you kind of have to read everything that's happening in front of you, because you have to see a guy you're covering right now may leave your zone and somebody else may come in. So you have to keep your eyes on the entire play, and that gives you a better opportunity to read what the quarterback's doing and jump routes. But I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. I don't think that, like, at the end of the day, like, while interceptions are the biggest stat we have for corners, they're not really the judge of corners. And interceptions, unless you're like Richard Sherman at the corner position, interceptions tend to fluctuate year to year. You could be a dominant corner and not post a lot of interceptions. In 2010, Darrelle Revis was a first-team All-Pro. 0 interceptions that season. There are limitations to Sauce Gardner, and I think like the lack of interceptions has something to do with it. But you get so much good. I mean, he's a guy who, and now this is assuming he finds his 2022-2023 form again, which we're hoping he gets back to being the player he was the first 2 seasons, and not so much the player he was in year 3. But that's the limitation I can live with. I don't think it's the type of thing that like is going to prevent Sauce Gardner from being a great corner, because I think that's like it's one thing if like you're watching a guy's shoulders, because then he can like kind of throw a move on you or something. But I think the hands are a difficult place to throw a fake on somebody. So I don't have a huge issue with it. I do think Charlie, that he does have a tendency to play this way, but I don't think it's a bad way to play. I think he's had plenty of success playing that way, and I think he can continue to have plenty of success. So it doesn't bother. I think it's a good observation. It just doesn't really bother me though. Next question is from Jimmy, who writes, John, if the run game reaches another level with Justin Fields adding a new dimension and Breece Hall returning to his previous form, do you see the Jets re-signing him? Is he worth being tagged after the season? Well, if this run game's not that dominant, then I would think the odds would be very strong that the Jets would try and keep Breece Hall around, because I don't know why you'd break up something that's succeeding. We talked about this yesterday. I spent the full segment trying to figure out contract value for Breece Hall, so feel free to go back and listen to that episode. But the thing with Breece Hall is that, like we always say, like, oh, you don't give running backs a second contract. And that's kind of been proven wrong the last couple of years. I mean, I think that there was a point 25, 30 years ago where maybe the running back was overvalued, and we've slowly seen it come into a more realistic area. And this began, you could talk about Mike Shanahan, Kyle Shanahan's father, who was the 2-time Super Bowl winning coach with the Denver Broncos, who like every single year, like the Broncos would have a new back rush for 1,000 yards, because it was all about the blocking scheme and it was all about the offensive line in Denver. And slowly we've seen, backfield by committee and the running back position devalued. And for the most part, I think this has actually been a more accurate way to value players, because running back is probably one of the lowest value positions on the field. But I think at some point, like, we've gone too far, where now it's like people are acting like you can never give a second contract to a running back. And I don't know that I agree with that. And Breece, he'll probably have another season on the odometer this year, but he still doesn't have that many touches in his career. He still should have a couple of good years left in front of him. So, I wouldn't have an issue with the Jets bringing back Breece if he has a big season. Look, if Justin Fields and Breece Hall are a dominant rushing duo, why wouldn't you keep that in place? But this goes back to a bigger issue that I see is the Jets should be proactive trying to re-sign their own players. If you go back 3 years, like 3 off seasons ago, I kept pounding the table for the Jets to re-sign Quinnen Williams that offseason. And they didn't. They waited a year. And what happened? Quinnen Williams had an all-pro season in 2022. If they had re-signed him the previous offseason, he would not have cost as much money because he was before his all-pro season. You want to sign a guy before he becomes an all-pro. Because if the Jets had re-signed Quinnen Williams 3 years ago in the offseason, they would have had one of the best contracts at defensive tackle in the league because they would have gotten all-pro performance. They wouldn't have had to pay him like an all-pro. Now, look, I don't know. Maybe Quinnen Williams wouldn't have taken the deal if the Jets had offered to him 3 years ago before his all-pro season. But that's one of the reasons you got to be proactive because you want to have a guy on a good contract number the season before he becomes an all-pro rather than waiting for him to be an all-pro and then having to pay him all-pro money. It's a small thing. Like, obviously, the most important thing is that Quinnen Williams remained a member of the New York Jets, but it's just one of those things that remind you of the importance of being proactive with re-signing your own players. So I think that, I'd like to see the Jets try and lock Breece up right now. Now, is Breece going to be amenable to that? How much is Breece going to want? That's the question. Does Breece want Saquon Barkley money? Well, it would be really difficult to justify that because as good as Breece has been, he hasn't had a 1,000-yard rushing season yet. And I know it was only a few yards short in 2023, but still, I mean, this is not a guy who's ever run for 1,500 yards. It's not a guy who's ever run for 1,600 yards. It's been a guy who's been a very good player, a guy who's been dynamic, a guy who's been a big play threat for this team, but still a guy where the production just hasn't been elite yet. So if you want Saquon Barkley money, then the answer I think would be no. But if he's more amenable to, something in the $12, $13 million range, I think that would be worthwhile. And because the player Breece Hall is right now, I think is worth that money. And if you do get that breakout, if Fields is the guy who unlocks Breece as a home run threat, if Breece has like one of those monster seasons, then suddenly you have a good contract on your hands. So it's kind of win-win. Whereas Breece is in his contract year right now. If he goes out and has a monster season with Fields, Jets are going to be in a tough dilemma because then you are talking about paying him like top of the league money at the running back position. So you want to avoid these things. I think you want to be proactive. I mean, so to answer the question, I try and get him under contract now if he's willing to take a reasonable number. And this is a guy who was a second-round pick. Second-round picks don't make a ton of money. He's already got one serious knee injury on him. So this is the type of guy who, like on paper, should be willing to take a deal in order to get his big payday, to get the money to set himself up for life. Willie, I don't know, but that's the mindset I would have if I were the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back next time to talk more Jets.